This is a tutorial that will take you through how to create a 3D model in a package called Blender and then bring that into Vortals for an overall mixed reality presentation. Now this tutorial is working off Blender 2.8. If you are using a version that is 2.79 and below, this interface will be a little bit different and so much harder to follow along. However, you will still be able to complete all of the tasks in this tutorial in an earlier version of Blender. However, I recommend that you use 2.8. Now, when you first start Blender, you'll be greeted with this scene. And the first thing you do is just left-click outside of the scene, and you'll find that initial dialog box will disappear. Now, to navigate in Blender's interface, it's a little different from Vortals. So what you do is you click your middle mouse button down, and you'll find the system will rotate the camera for you. If you press Shift and the middle mouse button, you'll find that you can pan the camera. Now, in the middle of our scene, when we load Blender up, you'll find already there is a cube that has been loaded in. Now, we're going to use this cube to create ourselves a model. This tutorial is based on a Valentine's theme, and so what we're going to do is we're going to load in a picture of a heart that's going to be our reference when we model. We're going to turn this box into a heart. So the first thing we need to do is add a reference picture to help guide our modeling pattern. So what we want to do is select Add, come down to Image, and choose Reference. And then we need to navigate to where we have our reference image. So you'll find this under the Tutorial 6 content. So it's the Love Heart reference. So I select that and load it as my reference point. And what you'll find is that it will load wherever your camera is pointing. So that this has oriented itself to be parallel with where you want the camera. Now in this case, that's not a good thing. We don't actually want that to be oriented that direction. So what we want to do is select our reference image, and then right up here in the top right-hand corner is a little arrow, and that has Transform. And you'll see under Transform there is a rotation box. So we click the X rotation, and we change that to 90 and we press Return. And you'll see that there's a little change in the orientation there. So if we click Y and we press 0 and press Return, you'll see again that rotated a little bit. And again, if we click Z and we choose 90, that will now have oriented itself in a particular direction. Now, of course, we could change these to face in different directions, and that will just change the way that we orient ourselves while we model this particular item. So it doesn't particularly matter on the Z-axis which way it's oriented. In this particular case, I'm choosing 90 just because. So the next thing we want to do is align our camera views so that we have what is called an orthographic view. So in a typical viewport, you'll actually have perspective. And so if you watch these lines, for example, they disappear off to a point in the distance. That actually isn't that useful for us when we're modeling. What we want is all of these lines to become parallel. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to click on this X up in the top right-hand corner. You can see there's an X here. And that will align our camera view to the an orthographic view from the side. And you can see now our heart is aligned and we don't see any perspective lines. Now, if I middle click and drag, you'll find immediately it jumps into perspective mode again, which is a bad thing. So we don't want to do that. When we want to come back up here and select X, and again, it reorients itself. So if you ever do that while you're modeling, you're going to find you have to come back up here and click X, and it'll come back into this view. So the next thing you might notice is that this is a grayed out box. And so if we're looking at this from both sides, this grayed out box will mean that when we try to select this particular vertex in orthographic mode, we won't be able to select any of the back-facing vertices. And that's a bit of a problem. So what we want to do is come up here and choose Viewport Shading to Wireframe. And so now we can see through the box and we can see all the way to the back vertexes that we want to select. So I'm going to go back into my orthographic mode, and I'm going to select a loop cut. So if I select loop cut and I come near my box, you can see it gives me an option to create a cut. If I click that and I go back into my orthographic mode, you'll see that it's created a single loop all the way around the box, and it's cut and it's put in vertex and edges into the box. So if I go back to my orthographic mode, you see now it gives me the option for a vertical one or two other horizontal ones that's cutting it in half. So I click for the vertical and I click for the horizontal. And basically what I'm doing is I'm creating a grid. And it's a grid with 4 by 4. That's where I want to end. So I can either right click or I select here to remove the loop cut mode. So I select up here, now loop cut mode is gone. And so basically what I want to do now is move all of these vertices around so that they mostly follow the outside of the heart. Now obviously I don't have that many points, so I can't perfectly replicate the contours of this heart, but I'm going to try follow it as best I can. So to start, what I'll do is I will select by dragging and clicking. So I drag and click the bottom parts of these. Then I come up here to move, and I'll move them down, and only the edge vertices hit the edge of the heart. And so now what I want to do is deselect and go back up to my selection box and drag and select the next 3 vertices. And then I choose my move and I will drag them down again. And then I deselect, go back to select, and we move. Now Blender does have shortcut keys, but for the sake of obviousness, I'm not going to use them. I'm going to follow this process all the way through. Now there's going to come a time when you've aligned all your vertices where you're going to have to make some choices. So you see now, to try fill the top part of the heart, I'm running out of points. So what I can do is I can move this point, for example, up and across, say up to here. But now you can see I'm not following the contours very well. And this is where your personal choices come into it, because you're going to have to decide where is the best part for these vertex or vertices to go. And it's not always obvious. It's up to the user to decide where you'll get the best results. So you see now I've decided that I'm actually going to move some of the points around, just making sure that at all times I'm trying to get as best coverage of this as possible. Now it's certainly possible to have increased the number of cuts I made originally so that I had more points to follow, but that becomes harder and harder to control. As you get more and more points that you have to start dragging around, you can very quickly lose control of where they're all placed in 3D space. And so you want to keep this as low res as possible for as long as possible. Sometimes that's not an easy thing, but the more you practice, the better you'll get at deciding where to put these vertex or vertices. And just because I am following the outside contour doesn't mean that I should ignore the flow of the mesh on the inside and leave that as a square. What I want to do is make a sort of a smaller inner heart for the mesh to follow. So now if I go back into my perspective mode, by middle clicking the mouse button, we can see that a heart has somewhat appeared out of this mesh. Now it's still a little hard to see because we have it in wireframe mode. So I'm going to select shaded mode again from the top right up here, and now I can see this mesh a bit better. And it does look a lot more like a heart, but it's still somewhat basic and unconvincing. And what I want to do now is subdivide these big meshes, these big faces, should I say, and make them smaller and smoother. So to do that, I want to add a modifier. But it's really important when you do this that you're not in edit mode. What we want to do is go into object mode. And so now when I add this modifier, the modifier will only be added to the whole object. So I'm going to choose Add Modifier, and I'm going to choose Subdivision Surface, which immediately creates a much smoother result. And so you see it's a lot more convincing as a heart, but it's probably not yet right. What I want to do is come over here to Viewport and choose 2. And so what this does is it changes the number of subdivisions that you can see within the viewport. And you can see that now, again, it's a lot smoother and it's looking a lot closer to where we want. But of course, it's still not quite right. It's still quite a blocky kind of heart. There's a real squareness to the system. So what we want to do is fix that up. So we're going to go back to Edit Mode. And in Edit Mode, you can see the final result, and then you can see your original mesh that the modifier was operating on. And what we're going to do here is we're going to select all of these edges out here, and we're going to move them closer to the center, which should hopefully create a smoother result. So to select the edges and not the vertices, what we want to do is come to here on the top left and choose Edge Mode. So now I'm going to shift and select the edges. But you'll notice that I'm not selecting all the edges. I'm just selecting a few of them. Now you certainly could select all of these edges manually, but what I want to show you is a bit of a trick that you can do depending on how your mesh is laid out. So now that I've selected these individual edges, I'm going to come to Select, and I'm going to go to Select Loops and choose Edge Loops. And what that will do is the computer will look through all the edges that are laid out in a loop fashion. And if it can find the loop, it will select all of those edges in that loop. And so now it's automatically selected all the outer edges that I wanted. So I'm going to go ahead and move them closer to the middle of the object. And now you can see that this is actually a lot more convincing. But I haven't operated on this side of the mesh. So what I want to do is deselect all of these edges, come out of Object Mode, and now I'm going to do a bit of a trick. I'm going to apply a modifier to the entire mesh again. So I come back here to Add Modifier, and I'm going to choose Mirror. And you see immediately the mirror has created a strange result where it has reflected half of the mesh. And if I choose Bisect, we now delete the part of the mesh that we don't want through the reflection. And what we can see in the end result is a much more convincing heart. So let's hide our reference for the moment to see if this is what we want. So under Empty up here, this represents our image reference. If we hide that, we can see this is a heart. And you can see it's pretty close. It's not too bad. There's a few things that you could change, but you might be happy with this. But let's just have a closer look at some of the things that are going on with this mesh. So when we look at the bottom half here, you can see there's a couple of weird pinching points where the mesh follows down around here and doesn't really quite follow how you might want it to flow. You kind of expect the flow of the mesh to come around here and then back up this way. But instead, it's coming around and then going behind and then following back up that way. And I don't think I like that. I want this to be a much cleaner mesh because when we look at it, we see a bit of a pinch. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back into Edit Mode and fix this mesh up. And if we look carefully at what's happening, we can see that there's a bit of an edge here that terminates. There's this point where the edge follows and then suddenly it stops. And where it stops, the mesh has got this pinch point. Now this is a thing that will take you a long time to get used to, but what I want to do is change how this whole mesh, what we call flows. I want to change where all of the lines will take you. And so when I look at this, I see a whole bunch of discontinuities within the mesh. I can see here there's a weird point here, and down here there's a weird point here, and that's reflected on the other side, of course. So I want to get rid of that. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to cut lines that adjust how the mesh flows. And if you've never done this before, it'll be really strange to look at, but then once you see it in action, it becomes really obvious. I'm going to go into my edit mode, I'm going to select vertices, and I'm going to choose knife. And when I do that, I'm going to click on this vertex here. And you see how it turns bright green, which means I've selected the vertex. And I come up here and you'll see that it actually locks onto this vertex. I'm going to click it and then press return. And what that does is it accepts that cut point. And then I'm going to repeat the process on the other side. I'm going to click here and I'm going to drag it to this mesh. I'm going to click again and I'm going to press return to accept that cut. Now you'll notice now the mesh is looking really ugly. There's sort of pinch points all over the place. And as I work, you're going to see the mesh look terrible, but we're going to fix that up. So what I've done here is I've selected the mesh where it was terminating, and I've cut up to this point where all the edges come together. And then I'm going to cut across to the middle, follow it down to the same part on the other side, and then connect up the mesh where it was terminating before. And I'm going to choose accept. So hopefully that was something you could follow. So now I've still got this triangular bit, and I don't want this triangle, I want this to be a square. So I'm going to cut from here. I'm going to accept that cut. And then I'm going to cut from the new cut point. Now the first time you do this, or the first time you see this, it is very weird and confusing. It doesn't make a lot of sense what's happening. But again, once I've completed it, you'll start to at least see what I'm trying to achieve. So for the moment, let me deselect all the faces. And what you can see is that the mesh now is really flowing in a crazy, wild way. And this is an important point because even though the last heart, before I made all these cuts, looked pretty good, there were still problems with it. And as you get more and more complex meshes, you'll find these problems become greater and greater issues that you have to learn how to fix. And so this is a very simple example that you can sort of use as your base starting point to learn how to control the flow of a mesh. So now that I've got these cuts, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change where those original edges were. So if you look at this system here, I'm going to go into face mode so I can select some faces. If you look here and here, this is now a 4-point mesh face that I could create if I could get rid of this edge. And the same can go for here. If I select here and select here, if I delete this line in the middle, I'll have what's called a quad, a 4-point face. And that's really what I'm trying to achieve. I'm trying to get rid of all the 3-point faces and all the bits where the mesh will pinch because we don't have a 4-point mesh, or face, should I say. So I'm going to select this, I'm going to shift select the next face, and I'm going to press delete. And I'm going to choose faces to delete. And now, of course, I've got this terrible looking hole in my mesh. So I need to switch to Vertex Mode, which is up here in the top left. And then I'm going to select a vertex here. I'm going to shift select the next 4 vertices on this potential face. And then, using a magic shortcut key, I'm going to press F. And that will cap this face. And I'm going to repeat that process for the face below. I'm going to select it, I'm going to shift select the other one, and I'm going to press delete and delete the faces. I'm going to go back into into vertex mode. I'm going to shift select the next 3 vertices, and I'm going to press F. And suddenly, the mesh has started to look a lot cleaner. And so I'm going to repeat that process wherever I find a triangular part of the mesh. So I'm going to select here, I'm going to select here, and I'm going to delete the faces. I'm going to go back into vertex mode. I'm going to select the first vertex. I'm going to shift select the next 3 vertices, and I'm going to press F. And again, we repeat on the other side. So now, if I remove ourselves from edit mode and go to object mode, and we look at our heart, now the flow of the mesh follows along the actual edge of the heart, like we kind of wanted to. Now you can see that it all comes to a point at the tip of the heart. So you could quite easily decide that you want that to be much more of a point, and you could go back into edit mode and you could adjust how this is all working. I'm going to choose to not do that. I'm happy with how my heart looks. Perhaps I could have moved this in closer to create more of a point. There's a whole bunch of things, and when it comes to a mesh, there's never a right answer. As long as it looks like you intended to, that's the real correct answer. How you get to that is entirely up to you. So I'm mostly happy with my heart, and I'm almost ready to export, but there are a few things that are still causing some issues. And the first is the most obvious, that the heart is not smooth. It's what we call faceted. You can see every polygon individually. And what we want to do is make sure that this is actually rendered smoothly. So to do that, in object mode, we select our heart, we come to object, and we choose shade smooth. And that then creates a nice smooth shading across the entire heart. But now that we look at the heart, we see a few more problems. We see that actually the shading is not smooth on all of the edges. And if we go back and we have a look at our flat shading, you can actually see part of the problem. And part of the problem is that the mesh isn't running very smoothly. And part of this is because of the fact that we've applied a smooth modifier and then a mirror modifier. Now in Blender, the order of operations of the modifier is actually very important. So what's happening is we're smoothing it first and then we're applying the mirror. We could, however, apply a mirror and then do the smoothing. And in this case, that will make a very big difference. So let me delete, by pressing the X button up here, both of these modifiers. And this time reapply the same modifiers, but in a different order. So now I'm mirroring the heart before I apply a smooth. So here we have the result of that operation. And now I'm going to apply the subdivision surface. And I'm going to choose 2 as my result. And now you can see that the mesh is quite dramatically different to what we had before. And so when you're creating these things and adding modifiers, you do have to consider the order that the modifiers have been created in. So now I'm happy with the way this looks. I'm going to reapply our smooth shading, and our heart is nearly ready to go. I do think it's a little bit wide here, so I'm going to go back into my edit mode. I'm going to choose to move my edges just a little bit further in. And again, you can go almost indefinitely with a mesh. This could be improved quite a lot. You can see there's a couple of sort of indentations here that need to be improved. You can improve a mesh indefinitely, basically, but I'm happy with this and I'm ready to export. So to export, we come up to File, we choose Export, and in this case, I'm going to export to an FBX model. So I click here, I navigate to where I want to export the file to, and I'm going to name it Heart Model Version 1. Now the important thing is never call something final, because no matter what happens, if you call it final, someone's going to ask you to change it. And then your final version is not the final version, and everybody gets confused. So always give it a version number. And now we're ready to load it into Vortals.